The theme of fasting is presented to us in today's gospel reading, and notice how our Lord affirms that once he is taken away, his followers will indeed fast. Interestingly enough, in the early church, Christians fasted, I believe it was 3 times a week, and during Lent, every single day was a fast day. Now, I'm not sure what requirements their fasting required at that time. The present requirement from that the church puts forth is that you can have 1 full meal and 2 other smaller meals in such a way that those 2 other meals do not add up to a full meal, and of course nothing eating and no eating in between. Now, some people, they just don't eat anything all day. That's another form of fasting. So there's actually different forms of fasting, and there are many, many benefits to fasting. Another interesting fact is that every major religion in the world practices some form of fasting. In other words, they recognize the value and the benefit of fasting, and so they persist in the custom of fasting at various times throughout their liturgical year or their religious calendar, whatever. So there are many benefits to fasting. And some people, for example, undertake fasting for health reasons. A common thing today is intermittent fasting, and there's many benefits to that, and maybe just even full fasting or doing a juice fast or just eating nothing for a couple of days. So there's definitely physical benefits to be had by fasting also, but the reason that we should undertake it is for spiritual reasons. And sometimes even when people do it for physical benefits, if you're a religious-minded person, make it both and try to focus on the spiritual aspect. So one of the benefits of fasting is that when we deny ourselves food, we're basically saying no to the body and the desires of the body. And so we become less fixated on bodily pursuits or the desires of the flesh, and it enables us to be more focused on spiritual realities and hopefully to get closer to God by doing that. And, just from my own personal experience of fasting, I also want to mention that for health reasons, some people are simply not able to fast. But they can practice other forms of self-denial, which is very, very beneficial. So, even for me, now with my health, for various health reasons, it's harder for me to fast now. But when I was young, I did serious fasting, and it's not just like one day, but you got to do it consistently. So when you're in the habit of fasting, and when you do that, you realize that your prayer life, your spiritual life becomes so much more focused. You feel so much closer to God. So there's definitely tremendous benefits to fasting, and many of you have probably experienced that personally also. So it causes us to be able to focus more on the spirit as opposed to the things of the body. And the other thing is that when we fast, there's less blood going to our digestive systems, and so we're more alert in many ways. Yes, we get tired when we fast, but in some way our mind is clearer. There's more oxygen going to the brain, which also helps us to pray. But one of the benefits that I wanted to focus on for today, the main benefit of fasting, is it enables us to have greater self-mastery, self-control, which is something essential to the spiritual life. And how do we gain greater mastery, greater self-control? Well, basically, we end up strengthening our will. And the weakness of the will is the major flaw in the spiritual life. The major struggle in the spiritual life is to follow God's will as opposed to our will. And often we know we should do God's will, but we end up doing our own will. And sometimes the reason for that is because the will, which makes the decision, is weak. We cannot will to do the right thing. We're just pulled by our passions. So the greater self-mastery, the greater self-control we have, the more we become capable of truly doing God's will and growing in our relationship and spreading his kingdom here on earth. So in order to acquire self-control, self-mastery, we need to manifest control over our passions, over our desires. So a person who lacks self-control, temptation comes along, let's say chocolate cake, they just give in. They have no self-control. They can't say no, even though the doctor said you got to avoid chocolate cake, let's say, they just can't say no. But when we practice saying no to chocolate cake or to food, as when we fast, we strengthen the will, so we have that self-mastery, so we can say no to chocolate cake, we can say no to food, and when other temptations come along, maybe greater temptations that somebody might be struggling with, they also have a greater ability to say no to those temptations also. So fasting, self-denial, enables us to grow in self-mastery, self-control, and to overcome our sinful inclinations, and to become the kind of persons that we are called to be. And sometimes these temptations is not just, the things that appeal to us, but sometimes the temptations is losing our cool. So we're tempted to get angry. We're tempted to become impatient. And so why? Because the person that we're dealing with is irritating us. It's painful. It's difficult to endure that person. But in like manner, it's painful or difficult to endure not eating on a fast day. And because we accustom ourselves to enduring that difficulty, it helps us to endure the difficult person that we might be dealing with, so we don't give in to losing our cool or getting angry or whatever it may be. And I wanted to relate some of this to today's feast. So today is the feast of Saint Maria Goretti, an extremely great saint for our times, a saint of purity. She was only 12 years old when she died, when she was martyred, basically. So if you know the story of her, she was born into a very poor family somewhere in Italy, and her father died, and so it was very difficult for her mom, and she had a little sister also, to make ends meet. And so they worked on a farm for the owner of the land, and there was another family that also worked along with them, and they kind of lived in the same quarters, but of course they had separate bedrooms for sleeping and things like that. But they basically worked together, and there were others who worked there. And in the other family, there was a young man, 18 years old, and his name was Alessandro Serenelli. And he had the habit of locking himself into the bedroom and looking at impure pictures. Now, this was back in 1902. And the kind of impure pictures or pornographic pictures that they had back then is probably very, very tame compared to what's accessible even to very young people today. But anyways, this of course caused him to be more lustful and to have the wrong attitude towards women. And he started making advances towards the young Maria Goretti. She was only 12 years old. But she was, there, and so he started making advances towards her. But you see, by locking himself in the bedroom and, looking at these impure images and giving in to lust, he was basically giving in to his sensual desires and fueling his selfishness by giving in to those sensual desires, and basically weakening himself in the area of self-control. And so he had to act on his impulses, right? And when he saw Maria Goretti, he would, be inclined towards her and to have sexual relations with her. And he tried to, get his way with her, but she resisted and said no, and she tried to avoid him as much as she could, but he threatened her. He said that if she told anyone, he would kill her. So unfortunately, Maria didn't tell anyone, and young people should tell an adult when things like this happen. Anyways, on one occasion, when it was time for the harvest, the threshing machines were working in the field, so it was very noisy, and Alessandro was with the adults working in the fields. Maria Goretti was back at the house taking care of her little infant sister. And Alessandro made an excuse to go back to the house, which he did. He dragged Maria into the kitchen and tried to force himself on her. She resisted, and said, "No, God does not will this, you will go to hell." So she kept resisting. He grabbed a pointed object and threatened to kill her, and she continued to resist, and he ended up stabbing her. She survived and tried to reach for the kitchen door, and I think he stabbed her a few more times. In total, he stabbed her 14 times. And eventually they found her in a large pool of blood, but she was still alive. She continued to live for another 24 hours. She was taken to the hospital, of course, or the doctor was called, and he said, there's nothing they can do for her. Every major organ in her body was damaged. So it was just a matter of time. She had lost a lot of blood also, but she was still conscious. And so they called for a priest. And the priest spoke to her and spoke to her about Christ on the cross and how he forgave those who persecuted him, those who crucified him. And the priest asked her if she could find it in her heart to forgive Alessandro for what he did to her. And when he asked her this question, she kind of lifted herself up with great exertion, right? In other words, she was very eager to say, "Yes, I forgive him." And not only did she forgive him, but she says, "I want him to be with me in heaven." In other words, no anger towards him at all, total forgiveness. And this is a 12-year-old girl. So she completely forgave him. She died. Alessandro was, of course, charged and sentenced to 30 years in prison. And for the longest time, he was very surly and kind of withdrawn, and he kept denying his guilt. He kept denying that he committed this crime. And so he was very withdrawn. Nobody liked him. He didn't like anybody else. Until one night, he had a vision or a dream, a very vivid dream, more like a vision. And in this vision, he saw himself in a field with many flowers around it. And he saw Maria Goretti walking towards him in this field, carrying a bouquet of flowers. And she came up to him and she handed him the flowers one by one. And the number was 14. One for each of those stab wounds. And by means of this vision, Alessandro understood or accepted the fact that she had indeed forgiven him. And because he understood that she had forgiven him, he was able to forgive himself or to seek forgiveness from God for his crime. And this brought about a tremendous transformation in Alessandro. He became more open, more friendly, more social, and because of good behavior, he was let out after 27 years in prison. And the very first thing that he did is he went to the mother of Maria Goretti to ask for forgiveness, and she also forgave him. And at the end of his life, Alessandro, when he was older, he joined himself to a religious community just as a third order, and he just, prayed with them and spent a lot of time with them. But just before his death, he wrote something warning people about the dangers of pornography. And it's kind of like pornography is widespread today. The secular society actually acknowledges that pornography is not good, but why do they allow it? I mean, they censor so many other things. Why not censor this? In some countries it is censored, but here it's readily accessible. So pornography is very dangerous, and it's very addictive. They say that men are more prone to it than women, but they're saying more and more women are getting addicted to it also. But you see, this all goes back to self-control. Do you and I have self-control? Do we have self-mastery? It's not to say that we have to fast, but we do need to practice some form of self-denial. Now, yes, the church's requirement for fasting Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, those are days that we have to fast, yes. But do we regularly practice self-control? Or do we just give in to our passions? And when we give in to our passions, we make decisions based on how we feel. Oh, well, I don't feel like praying right now, and so I'm going to watch TV or whatever. And when we give in to our feelings, it means our passions dominate as opposed to our intellect dominating. So the ideal is that our intellect dominates, and a very good thing for this is to have what's called a plan of day for our spiritual life. And a plan of day means we go to bed at a certain time, we wake up at a certain time, we say our prayers at a certain time, we do our spiritual reading at a certain time, whether we feel like it or not. Because often we're not going to feel like doing it. You know, when the alarm goes off, most people don't feel like getting out of bed, but we know we should. And the ideal is that we do it, because when we do that, we strengthen our will. Every time we don't get out of bed when we should, we're weakening our strength of will, which means our struggle in the spiritual life is going to be more difficult. And we're going to probably end up making the wrong decisions, choosing the wrong things. So let us do what we can to consider for ourselves, do I have self-mastery, self-control? And do I have a good plan of life that I stick to as best as I can? Just a few announcements. Today at 2 p.m. we will have a holy hour. This is being organized by the Knights of Columbus. You're all welcome to attend it. We will have exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, adoration, and we will conclude with benediction. Also this evening we have a potluck dinner and games night, once again organized by the Knights of Columbus. And if you can, bring some food, bring some games. Even if you can't bring anything, you're welcome to come out and just enjoy the festivities, enjoy a good time with other parishioners. Please note we will have a funeral on Monday at 11 a.m. for Joyce Su Ping. Visitation will be at the Ogden Funeral Home on Sunday from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m.